Welcome to the Bright Business Forum. Today we have with us an individual with 20 plus years experience in the mining and engineering sphere. He has a master's in engineering and management from the University of Cambridge from the year 1996. He's represented global mining organizations, including two of the biggest, one being BHT Billiton and Rio Tinto. He has also extensively lived and worked overseas prior to him returning to our beloved nation. Welcome, Mr. Ryan Rockwood.
Thanks a lot, Naveen. Happy to be here.
So, Mr. Ryan, just to get an overview of the mining industry, could you maybe tell us what the mining industry is?
Sure. So mining is essentially extractive industries. A lot of the things that we look in this room basically come from mined materials.
Right.
So if it is the copper within the wiring here,
Okay.
the white paint, the steel which the building is built with,
Okay.
they all come from the ground.
Okay.
And essentially, even though you may not be aware of it, mining is an essential part of all the daily things that we use. And you could also say that everything in the world either has to be grown or dug up. And the dug up section is what mining is all about.
Right. So, would you say that this is why any country, region, nation requires mining?
Yes, we do. I mean, they are essential elements of our everyday life.
I see. And what are the different types of mines predominantly in Sri Lanka?
Sure. So in Sri Lanka, you have mines which are gemstones. I think that's what people know most about because
Correct.
they're precious stones and they excite people and so on.
Yes.
Then you've also got mines which are for construction materials. So essentially sand, river sand and so on. That gets people a little less excited because there are certain practices which may be of concern to some.
Okay.
And then you've also got quarries for stone, which are also part of the construction industry.
Okay.
Then apart from that, you have a third type of mine in Sri Lanka, which are essentially the export minerals.
Right.
And here we talk about graphite, mineral sands, mica, and quartz.
Okay.
So this particular forum is, of course, partly about the Mineral Exporters Association, which has just come into being.
Okay.
And it's the third category that would be relevant to that subject.
I see. What would you say the most important mineral that we export is?
I think by value at the moment, it's quartz.
Okay.
So we do somewhere around $15 million per annum of quartz exports.
Right.
And that quartz exports are market share wise, sea quartz has over 60% of the market share.
Okay.
And then the next biggest player has about 15% of the market share.
I see. And how important do you reckon mining is to Sri Lanka as a whole, especially in terms of the economy?
So, my area of expertise is mainly the export minerals.
Right.
The export minerals is actually quite modest at the moment.
Okay.
But if you look at history, pre the First World War, at Sri Lanka at its peak was exporting almost 20% of graphite.
Oh, wow.
And that was of worldwide supply, 30% of worldwide supply was our peak, and it accounted for 20% of Sri Lankan exports.
Oh, wow.
So if you put that in context, I mean, the graphite industry alone was probably as big as our apparel industry is today.
Okay.
So the question is, it was that big once.
Okay.
It's shrunk a lot over the years. Right now, the entire graphite market is over 1 million tons per annum, and Sri Lanka is doing less than 10,000 tons.
Oh, wow.
So that's less than 1%, and there's only 2 graphite mines which are operating,
Right.
Bogala graphite and Kahatagar graphite.
Okay.
But at the peak of our mining industry, graphite industry, there's probably 40 different mines.
Oh, okay. So have the life cycle of those mines just come to an end, or?
Yeah, so I think it's a combination of a couple of things. One is that those mines discontinued when massive deposits were discovered in China and Madagascar.
Right.
They also had technical challenges, which is that the mines were under the water table.
Okay.
So pumping and so on was more complicated. And then it's a question of economics, being able to extract, your cost of extraction being less than your revenue generation.
Understood. So what's the typical life cycle of a mine? Like if you take graphite, for instance.
I think you can apply a life cycle which applies to all mines. So there are essentially 5 stages. There is exploration, which is discovery of the mineral. There is your stage where you get into permits and feasibility.
Okay.
Is this viable? Can you get the necessary approvals to go ahead? And in that section, you also do your environmental clearances. Then there is the construction stage,
Okay.
where you actually build the mine. Fourth, you have the operations. That's when you actually make money. So in the first 3 stages of that, it's all cash negative.
Okay.
You're basically spending money with the hope that you can get to
Profitable
you can get to revenue generation.
Okay.
And that's the operations phase. And then the 5th stage is closure,
Mm-hmm.
where you would actually close the mine down, you rehabilitate, you'd find employment for the people who were in the mine, and return the land to another form of use.
Understood.
It's also important to keep in mind just how long things take.
Mm-hmm.
Because by definition, exploration is something you're going into uncharted territory. You're looking at trying to discover something, a hidden treasure within the earth.
Correct.
So by definition, you very often don't find something.
Okay.
That's why it's called exploration.
Mhm.
So because unlike when you're growing something, this resource in the ground, it's finite.
Mhm.
It's been created by heat and pressure over millennia, and you're extracting it over a much smaller time period.
Mhm.
So only way a mining company can survive is to find the next mine,
Understood.
find the next deposit. So hence exploration is a key part of that cycle.
For sustainability, obviously.
Correct.
Mhm.
Correct. So large mines may often take up to 10 years to get to the production stage.
I see. Wow. So, Mr. Ryan, in terms of land that mines are situated in, is it only the landowner that could actually mine that land?
Now, this is a very interesting question. So
Okay.
it's something that confuses a lot of people.
Right.
Land rights and mineral rights are completely different.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
So the mineral everywhere in the country is owned by the government. There is a different mineral licensing program
Okay.
which is administered by the GSMB, the
Mhm.
Geological Survey and Mines Bureau.
Okay.
The landholder has rights only to basically the first 1 or 2 meters of topsoil.
Okay.
Anything that is under that, and together with all the minerals in it, belong to the state.
I see.
So just because you are the landholder, you do not automatically gain rights to the minerals. And this program and this framework applies not just in Sri Lanka, but right throughout the world.
I see.
So in terms of mining, there are 2 types of mining. There is surface mining, which we
Okay.
call open cast,
Okay.
and there is underground mining.
Okay.
So if you take underground mining, for example, and I have spent some time in South Africa,
Okay.
you can be mining underground coal or gold. Some cases gold is 1 kilometer down. What's happening on the surface, you may have a corn farmer,
Really?
and he has absolutely no claim
on the gold.
on any of the gold or the coal. So
Wow.
that misunderstanding is there with a lot of people who initially think land rights, mineral rights, same thing.
Okay. So there's no loyalty that goes to the landowner per se either?
Absolutely not. There is no royalty which accrues to the landholder. In fact, this is very much stated in the 1992 Minerals Act in section 37, where it specifically mentions that the compensation due to the landholder is to exclude any minerals contained beneath the land.
I see.
So royalty is paid to the Mines Bureau on a percentage of revenue generated from the minerals.
I see. So just thinking outside the box, say I potentially owned a property in Ratnapura and I'm walking in my garden and I dig up a tree and I find a gemstone, for example. Is it technically my property or the state's?
So in that case, gemstones are governed by a different set of rules.
Okay.
But I believe that that gemstone, even if you did find it there, you would pay the government a royalty on it.
Oh wow, okay. Understood. So that would potentially leave some room for corruption, I believe.
Yeah, so the way it happens is a little bit more nuanced.
Okay.
So essentially 80% of land in Sri Lanka is owned by the government.
Right.
Then there's a large proportion of those lands which are administered by state-owned enterprises.
Okay.
So it could be plantation companies, it could be former state-owned enterprises which had a large amount of land but are not using it anymore. And the boards of those companies are typically run by political appointees.
Oh, I see.
Right? So you might be the state-owned enterprise doing industry X,
Okay.
which has absolutely nothing to do with mining, but soon as you find out that there are some minerals on this land discovered by somebody else and who have deployed their risk capital, remember the exploration phase we talked
Understood.
about?
Yep.
And that they have deployed their risk capital to discover something, you can become a block to them progressing.
Okay.
So the state-owned enterprise boards then seek patronage and can seek to frustrate and block a miner from progressing because they just simply can.
Wow. So saying that, can a landholder block mining projects from taking place in Sri Lanka?
Not only can they often do.
And how would they potentially do that?
මේක මගේ ඉඩම ඔබතුමාට එන්න බෑ. I mean, this literally happens
Okay.
by people actually thinking this is their personal land.
See. So there comes a kind of a paradigm when it comes to, oh, I bought a property in Minuangura, for example, but you technically just own a couple of meters of soil and nothing that is underneath.
So, Naveen, I'm talking about state-owned enterprises here. I'm not talking about a private individual who has half an acre of land.
Okay.
I'm talking about state-owned enterprises which have hundreds of acres of land,
Okay.
which are vested from them, and they may have a board today of certain people. Minister changes, 2 months later, there's a different set of board. I'm talking about this category.
Okay, so that would kind of include industrial zones, industrial parks, etc. Yeah?
Yeah. I mean, the reality is in an industrial zone and an industrial park, it's more complicated to mine. Because
Okay.
there's obviously some activity going on.
Sure,
there.
sure.
By definition, you can only mine in an area where you have the freedom to mine. So you shouldn't be having to relocate large amounts of people. If there's a running business there, a going concern, they should be not interfered with.
Understood.
Because we may be from the mining industry, but our objective is not to stop all other industries so that we can progress.
Okay.
It has to be a balanced, sensible, reasonable approach.
So, Mr. Ryan, in terms of mining and its correlation with the environment, do you think mining could influence such natural disasters as landslides?
Yeah. So, Naveen, I think the mining industry is obviously having an impact on the environment.
Okay.
It's a question of how much of an impact that is, and is it manageable?
Okay.
So what is cemented in people's minds is essentially what you just referred to, the landslide. So there was a very tragic case in Brazil where an iron ore tailings dam failed, and that led to a massive slide of all the tailings. Tailings is basically the waste product of mining.
Okay.
And it essentially wiped out an entire village.
Oh, wow.
And about 100 people were buried.
I see.
And many of them were the bodies were never even recovered.
Okay.
So this is the worst case scenario, which gets in the headlines and highlighted.
So it gets all the press.
It gets all the press.
Okay.
But what we need to think about is how statistically significant are these events. I'm saying the event itself is absolutely atrocious and should be avoided at all costs, and those responsible need to be held to account. But we need to have a balance of how many of these incidents happen versus how many mines operate without any issue and under a very conservative management. So the analogy that I would give you is, if you think about road accidents in cars versus aeroplanes, car accidents and fatalities are probably 1 in 1,000, versus in aeroplanes it's 1 in 1,000,000.
I see.
But not long ago, people would be very scared about flying in planes versus
Going in a car. Correct.
So these are the same kind of issues that you have in the environmental arena.
Understood.
But we need to remember that mining is a highly regulated industry.
Okay.
So if you recall stage 2 of the mining life cycle,
Yes.
after exploration, permits and feasibility, you cannot go to your mining stage without having done either in Sri Lanka it's called an IE, Initial Environmental Evaluation, or an EIA, Environmental Impact Assessment. You cannot move to that next stage without having done that.
Okay.
Then once you do start mining, you have to periodically, every year, revalidate your EPL, your Environmental Protection License.
Okay.
So there are many aspects which are regulated by the Environmental Authority, and these are regulated for very good reason.
Understood.
Because this is a heavy industry. There are safety issues. And safety, when companies report, typically the first parameter they report on is safety before profit.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right? So we talk about the 3 Ps: people, planet, profit.
So, Mr. Ryan, with everything we've discussed in terms of the environment, mitigation of risk in mines and its processes, its potential implications on the environment and people, obviously, what are some examples of international best practices in terms of the rehabilitation of a mine, especially when it comes to its final stage of closure?
Yeah, very good question. So one which I had the privilege of seeing myself firsthand was in Cornwall, in the southwest of England, seeing the Eden project.
Okay.
So the Eden project is a former kaolin mine, which I used to actually work at for a company called Imerys.
Okay.
And kaolin is hydrated aluminium silicate, which is used for paper coatings and other applications, where the hole in the ground was not only rehabilitated, but it was created into a beautiful theater of vegetation,
right?
Natural and greenhouse generated vegetation, and put in a dome, and it became a tourist attraction.
Oh, nice.
So in England, this particular location has around 570,000 people visiting each year.
Really?
Which is basically a mine which has been rehabilitated.
Okay.
And it's been going on for 20 years.
I see.
So it's a great success story of rehabilitation and and responsible use of the land after mining.
I see. Do we have any such, prudent examples in Sri Lanka?
I think there are some good examples of rehabilitation which do happen in Sri Lanka, but we haven't yet turned a mine into a tourist location.
Sure.
We haven't gone that far yet.
Okay.
But it also has happened in other countries. So not just Eden Project where I used to work at, but even the Sunway Water Park in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, is a former tin mine.
Oh, really? Okay.
Which is attracting millions of visitors.
Yeah, I've actually been there. I never knew that.
Yes.
So, Mr. Ryan, in your experience throughout the last 20 plus years, which or what types of mining do you reckon are pollutive?
Yeah, so it's all about pollution management.
Okay.
So clearly the more processing you do of that mineral, the more hazardous waste you may generate.
Okay.
Right? So if, for example, you do gold mining and you're using mercury and you're releasing that mercury into streams of water and so on, clearly that's going to be very adverse.
Sure.
But if you're Barrack or Newmont, you will not do those kind of things. So you will adhere to a standard which is set by the environmental regulator.
Okay.
So what needs to be considered here is not as much about what type of mining is pollutive as to does the environmental regulator enforce the regulations?
I see.
Because do you have political interference which allows a certain company to behave and conduct itself in a way which is inconsistent with the environmental regulations? And how and to what extent are those regulations enforced?
Okay.
So some people take a view that, we shouldn't allow a Chinese company to come here or an Indian company to come here, but we should allow a Swiss company and an American company. So these are very simplistic ways to view things, because it's nothing to do with the nationality of the company. It's much more about the regulator itself and enforcing their own rules and regulations.
Sure.
So again, there are horror stories of things that happened in the 90s or 80s in Africa where companies went and basically misbehaved. But those were during an era and a time period in which there weren't environmental regulations and they weren't enforced.
I see.
So those kind of activities now in Sri Lanka, difficult if not impossible, especially in the sort of social media arena where things get exposed very fast.
Well, that's good to know. Mr. Ryan, in the industry of mining, there's always this term that's been coined and thrown around, which is value addition. In terms of value addition, as per the minerals policy, what would be the definition of it?
Okay, so the minerals policy, the last discussion we had on it was in January this year, and the definition that was mentioned in the forum, which included the Mines Bureau, the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Industries, the various other scientific institutions, Slintech, and industry practitioners, was the following. It's basically value addition is defined as a process which leads to enhancement of the bulkhead pit value either by selective mining, processing, beneficiation, or the finding of new markets.
Okay.
So I think this is a very interesting definition, and it's in fact the same definition that was applied in the previous version of the minerals policy in 2018 And I'm glad to see that 5 years on, they have retained that definition, even though there's been a lot of debate on this subject.
Okay.
And to sort of explain a little bit, what it's basically saying is that value addition is not a HS code change.
Okay.
It's not a chemical change in the material.
Okay.
It can be physical separation, and in fact it can be even selling the same material to parties A and B, but if you are able to sell it to party B at a higher price, that's also value addition.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So it comes back to, if you use the analogy of tea, you know, we were selling tea for hundreds of years, but then Dilma pioneered taking that same tea, packaging it, branding it, and selling it to new markets at a much higher price with our own branding. So again, with minerals, it's about being able to find a market and being able to sell that product at a superior price. That also constitutes value addition.
I see.
As opposed to simply a HS code change and a chemical change, which is, you know, laboratory stuff. It's
Right.
It's academic stuff.
Okay.
So that is the definition.
Understood. So, in terms of this practice that we discussed on value addition, what are or how have other countries balanced value addition versus raw form export?
Yeah, so Naveen, raw form export is a dirty word in Sri Lanka.
Okay.
Right? But it's not a dirty word in Australia or South Africa, where mining contributes a very large proportion of GDP.
Okay.
So in Australia, for example, their biggest export is iron ore. That's a $50 billion industry.
Wow.
Right? But, and they went through a debate for a long period of time about whether they should have steel or not, and they concluded, no, we don't need steel, because steel will be the natural value addition to iron ore. And they decided not to go for that, and basically send out the raw material, and built up a huge iron ore industry in the country, where they supply their material to, originally it was the steel mills in Japan, POSCO, Nippon Steel, and then afterwards that was in the 80s and 90s, and more recently it's been the Chinese.
Right.
So those countries use it and make steel from it.
Understood.
Even though the raw materials you need to make steel is essentially coking coal and thermal coal, both of which Australia has in addition to iron ore.
Right.
But they still allow the material to go out and benefit from the revenues generated from those exports.
Right.
So if you look at Sri Lanka, for example, so I mean, just to give a couple of stats, I mean, Australia has for iron ore probably 15 mines. They cover 35% of global market share.
Right.
But in terms of steel plants, downstream processing, it's less than 1%.
Wow.
It's tiny, right? So they are doing the opposite of what we in Sri Lanka try to mandate, that you must do value addition, otherwise stop the exports. So, you know, our thinking has to be more progressive along this line. Similarly, if we look at mineral sands, Australia again has 10 mines covering 20% of global market share, but their percentage of downstream processing, which is basically making pigment, making paint, or making synthetic rutile, is a fraction of that.
I see.
So why is that the case? The case is basically because value addition may not necessarily be conducive just because you have the raw material. You may need other factors of production. Typically you need power. Now we all know the power situation in Sri Lanka at the moment.
Absolutely.
You need power not only which is cheap, which is, you know, perhaps less than 10 cents per kilowatt hour. You also need reliable power, because you can't be in a situation where you have melted the metal and you have a power cut. The molten metal will basically condemn the plant. Your multi-$100 million plant, and that will be the end of that. So power is required. You also need quite often reagents. You need acid.
Okay.
So for example, sulfuric acid is often a byproduct of another process. And that acid is given in other countries, they pay you to take it away. And you might just put a pipeline and get that straight to your plant. But versus here, we don't have that raw material. So you have to import it. And this is why we have been trying, for example, to do value addition at Lanka Mineral Sands, which is the Pulmude, the only operating mine that we have had in mineral sands since 1957.
True.
And we have tried several times to run expressions of interest, RFPs, solicit people to come and do value addition. But starting from, I'm aware of one procedure which went in 1996 to 2018 to 2021. The same issues mean that nobody goes for the next stage. But we still don't want to accept that having power, having acid, being able to dispose of hazardous waste. Now, why does Australia not do some of this? They are like, you want your hazardous waste? Do it in another country. Right? We are only 65,000 square kilometers. Australia is 7 million square kilometers. But they still don't want to do it.
Correct.
So why are we going down this line? It's a lack of understanding. The other part that people quite often overlook is they don't realize chemistry. Just because a material is called ilmenite doesn't mean that all forms of ilmenite are conducive to make synthetic rutile. It's got to do with how much iron and impurities are in that. Or if we look at phosphate, we have a beautiful deposit in Epavala. It's not so easy to make triple phosphate out of it. We are selling rock phosphate for decades. So people might ask, so why don't you make triple phosphate and stop our sensitive subject, stop our import of fertilizer? The reason is very simple. Because our phosphate deposit has high fluorine in it.
Okay.
And this is something that has been voiced by Professor Pitawala from Peradeniya University. You take some grab samples from this, there's anything from 2% to 5% fluorine in it. So you cannot take it to that next stage. So there are technical and scientific things that the layman doesn't understand, or there could be solutions which the academic understands and is possible in the lab, but is impossible in a commercial scale.
Understood. Wow. So Ryan, any examples for value addition internationally in your experience?
Yeah, so I worked in South Africa for a few years.
Okay.
So if you look at an area which is known as Richards Bay, there is a certain amount of value addition that happens there, and particularly by Richards Bay Minerals, which takes their mineral sands further down the line, which is what we were trying to do at Lanka Mineral Sands. But if you look at that location, it has a lot of infrastructure in it.
I see.
So it has 280 kilowatt power lines running through it. It has bayside aluminium, hillside aluminium smelters. It's where all of South African coal exports go through. There's about 60 million tons worth of coal exports that go through that location. And in fact, I used to work at one of the coal mines.
I see.
And it was Africa's oldest coal mine at the time. You have a basically ecosystem there which makes it amenable for value addition to happen, because you've got several different industries which have come together there, and you have the ability to deal with hazardous waste and so on, and that is the environment in which value addition happens, but it doesn't happen overnight. if you look at the Richards Bay Minerals operation, it's been running for 50 years.
I see.
And it's globally a globally significant producer.
So what you're saying is over a significant period of time, they've centralized all the necessary resources into one place in order to kind of enhance a raw product into an end product.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. But even in South Africa, even in this location, for the whole of Africa, there is no pigment plant.
All right.
They don't make the end product.
I see. For whole of Africa.
Yeah.
I see.
Because the other factor that you need, and thank you for reminding me, is technology.
Right.
Right? You need the know-how. Know-how is in people's heads.
Yes.
You can't say, okay, we got the raw material, we can now make the end product. It doesn't apply to say, we've got brilliant engineers from Morotua University, which we do. Let's get 100 of them together and build the next Facebook. You've got computers here, you've got same as Silicon Valley. Why don't we have a Facebook here? It's because of that system, that technology. They're safely guarded and not easy to break into. That know-how is protected. It's intellectual property.
Understood. Okay. Any value addition success stories that you know of?
Yeah, so I think we're making quite a good progress with graphene in Sri Lanka. So LOLC built a graphene plant a few years ago.
Okay.
And they have manufactured graphene, which is basically a single layer of carbon, which has fantastic thermal properties, electrical properties, compression strength, tensile strength, and can have many different wonder applications.
I see.
And I was a couple of years ago in Cambridge University for an alumni event, and went to the Cambridge Graphene Center, and they're all very excited about what is possible from this. So LOLC has done this, as well as I think just a few weeks ago, Bogler Graphite had produced graphene oxide, and they also are trying to take that into the cement industry. And there could be success stories here.
I see.
And I think what is important here, Naveen, is to realize that if people can do value addition, they will. So if you can sell a product which was at X for 2X, you don't need government policy to do that. You'll do it yourself.
Correct.
But there are often factors of production which may restrict that ability to do it. And you mustn't just look at the price point.
Okay.
So if we take graphene, for example, which is a success story in Sri Lanka, graphene will sell for perhaps $200 a kilogram.
Okay.
Graphite sells for $2,000 a ton.
Wow.
So graphene is essentially selling for $200,000 a ton, right? So the layman will tell you 2,000, 200,000, 100x value addition නේද? graphite එක නාත්තන්න. එළියට දාන්න එවන්න එපා. But what they don't realize is the cost of production of graphene
is so high.
Maybe $150,000 a ton, or maybe $250,000 a ton, higher than the sale price, until you reach critical scales of economy.
Right.
So production economies. So this is just people have turned a blind eye to this. And then the other issue is also the size of the market. Now graphite has been exported for, as you mentioned earlier in the conversation, for probably a century. And the size of the market is 1 million tons per annum.
Right.
But the graphene market, maybe a few hundred tons.
Oh, really?
Maybe it's really embryonic at the moment. So that needs to be understood and appreciated.
Okay, excellent. So Ryan, I think we're moving on to a bit of a interesting topic. I think a lot of the public is unaware of it. I'm sure you have some sort of insight into it. Is the mining industry taxed? And if it is taxed, is the government's share of the revenue sufficient?
Yeah, so the way the mining industry is taxed is in addition to the normal corporate income tax that all companies have to pay, the mining industry also pays royalties.
Okay.
So if you remember, we talked earlier about all minerals belong to the state. Royalties are paid not on your bottom line, but on your revenue line.
Okay.
So in Sri Lanka, this is about 6 or 7%, depending on whether it's exported or domestic use. And you pay the royalty and the tax regardless of whether you make profit or not.
All right.
Because it's revenue based.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
And prices go up, prices go down, but your government share in terms of this royalty remains certain.
Okay.
Versus if government was getting a dividend or a shareholder is getting a dividend, because mining goes through, commodities go through cycles, there are very often times where there are no dividends paid because this dividend is based on profit.
Correct.
Now if we come to your question, which is the government getting enough? The answer is, if you look at the royalty and you assume a 25% profit margin, that is the equivalent of a 28% royalty tax on 7%. Did you follow the maths? So essentially 7% royalty, assuming a 25% margin, is the equivalent of a 28% bottom line tax.
Right.
Now that 28% bottom line tax comes before your 30% income tax.
Wow.
Right? So, and the income tax for exporters used to be 14%.
Okay.
So in my view, the 14% to 30%, that's consistent with international benchmarks.
Okay.
Most countries do have taxation along those lines, and our exporters enjoyed some benefit which was over and above what others were getting earlier.
Okay.
So my personal view is we should be happy for those who were receiving that, should be happy for what they got in the past, but they shouldn't be dwelling on that. They should now move on to, let's try to make our businesses profitable even with this 30% tax. So you take the 28% royalty equivalent tax, 30%, and then you have also dividend withholding tax on top of that, another 15%. You're well over 60% taxation for the mining industry without, and the government receiving that without any capital being deployed and without any risk being taken.
Right.
So how much is enough if that's not enough already?
Understood. So Ryan, we spoke of taxation. When we come into the topic of royalties, how does Sri Lankan royalties differ with international?
Sri Lankan royalties are very high.
I see.
So as I said, we are paying around 7% royalty versus if you look at the world's most advanced mining jurisdiction, Western Australia, their royalty is 5%.
I see.
So, and remember, on a profit basis, if you're using a 25% margin, that 2% is basically a 2% difference translates to an 8% bottom line difference.
Correct.
And this is really material. Okay? Then if you take within Australia other jurisdictions like South Australia, the royalty is only 3.5%. Plus they give you 2% royalty concession for the first 5 years. If you look at Victoria in Australia, the royalty is 2.75%, still lower, because they want to encourage and facilitate mining activity.
Okay.
Right? So then if you go, and Australia is a tier 1 destination for investment.
Correct.
Probably the best in the world along with Canada. If you go to Africa, the royalty regime is still much lower. So in Mozambique, it's something like 2%. In Sierra Leone, it's 4%. In Kenya, they're giving you 2.5% for the first 5 years.
I see.
So they are able to attract investment that we are competing for, right? Because we need to remember that the minerals Sri Lanka has are not unique to Sri Lanka alone. Yes, we have some very interesting assets, but they are available in other countries also. So when you are making your business case, when a company is making their business case, they won't do it only on tax. Country risk is obviously the primary concern.
Sure.
But they will consider this into their financial model. And if we are not competitive, then they may go elsewhere.
So in brief, given the discrepancy between international countries' royalties, and the royalty fees Sri Lanka demands from the mining industry, would you say we are almost turning back potential investors from coming in?
Yeah, I think it's a factor. There are other issues also which investors have, but this is definitely an issue. In addition to the royalty, we also have something in Sri Lanka called cess, which you don't get anywhere else in the world. It's basically royalties paid on revenue. Cess is incurred on volume. Basically, it's linked to the value addition story we said earlier. They're saying basically unless you do take it to the next level of a HS code change, then you are liable to pay cess. So if we take the cess figures haven't been refreshed, but if you look at the previous values of the cess before the devaluation, it accounted for almost another 5% on top of our 7%. Wow. So this is definitely constraining the industry and is a concern. And we need to be realistic about why we currently have one mineral sands mine in the country. We have 2 graphite mines in the country. We have 1 phosphate mine in the country. We have 1 mica mine in the country. Taxation policy doesn't help.
I understand. So, Mr. Ryan, in terms of investment into Sri Lanka and mining, what do you think the potential is for foreign investors in Sri Lanka?
So we've got deposits which are known and the mineral inventory has been identified. That was stage 1 of the mining life cycle. The real investment only comes when you go into construction and operation. So there is a pipeline of projects which need to move forward, and then there are also existing mines and existing operators who can expand their operations. So we can probably, mining is never going to be a multi-billion-dollar industry in Sri Lanka, but I think $500 million worth of exports
is a
possibility. And that is not something to be ignored.
Correct. Especially given the current economic crisis.
Correct.
Do you think there are any barriers that kind of prevent people from coming in?
Yeah, so we talked a bit about taxation, we talked a bit about land ownership, that's a big issue.
Correct.
The other barrier is often foreign ownership. So, and we talked earlier about know-how also and technology and transfer of that technology, plus also access to markets. It's access to end products, customers, that market, and also access to capital.
Sure.
Because we probably won't have our local companies investing in a subject that they don't know about, going in for big amounts of capital. So all of those factors are important and need to be dealt with in order to uplift the industry and give it a kickstart. If you look at even some of the quartz companies that set up here, they often started with collaboration with a Japanese partner.
Okay. That kind of shoots back to the know-how.
Yes.
Okay.
Know-how, capital,
Sure.
risk, access to markets.
Okay. And I think in Sri Lanka we have this thing called the island mentality that I discussed in an early interview. And in this, we've kind of, I think Sri Lanka as a whole have come to a mindset that we shouldn't allow foreigners to come and invest. In your standpoint, do you think we should allow foreigners to invest and get into the mining industry?
So I think it should be a balanced approach,
Okay.
right? I think our resources belong to the people of the country, and the people should benefit from it. But if the resources remain in the ground, nobody benefits,
Correct.
right? Some people will say, "Ne, අපේ සම්පත් ඊළඟ පරම්පරාවට තියන්න." You know, but your grandchildren may not benefit from it if somebody comes and builds housing on top of minerals there.
Correct.
Right? So it needs to be balanced. Now, our Foreign Exchange Act of 2017 stipulates that mining is a restricted sector.
Okay.
The same as freight forwarding, shipping, deep sea fishing, agriculture. You have a 60-40 mix
Okay.
where foreigners are allowed 40%.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a provision that foreigners are allowed that, and they should be allowed to come in at that level. In certain circumstances, depending on the scale of the investment and the complexity of it, foreigners can hold a percentage beyond that.
Okay.
Now, if you look at other countries, they also have restrictions on foreign ownership.
Okay.
So, for example, in South Africa, there is something called BE, Black Economic Empowerment,
Okay.
where that percentage is set at 26% for the historically disadvantaged persons. And obviously, a foreigner cannot hold that percentage. If you look at in Indonesia, there is something called Bumiputra. The people of the soil get a certain percentage. That is often somewhere around 49%, 49 to 51%.
Okay.
So this applies in other countries also, and we need to take a balanced approach. But you know, we should not turn away capital when it wants to come here,
Sure.
especially not in this situation.
Absolutely. I have a bit of a serious question. Do you believe that corruption is a problem in the mining industry, especially in Sri Lanka?
Mining is a highly regulated industry.
Okay.
You need lots of approvals to go to your next stage, and it also has very long timelines, as we saw in the cycle.
Sure.
So when you have long timelines and multiple approvals, it creates an environment and gives authorities power in which to misappropriate resources from the developer.
Sure.
So it is an issue, there's no doubt about it. You asked, is it a more of a problem in Sri Lanka versus, let's say, our closest neighboring country?
Sure.
And I think the answer is, I'm not sure,
Okay.
but I wouldn't be surprised if links with big government, practices of tax evasion, environmental breaches, corruption, anti-bribery, that, you know, the strength of anti-bribery and corruption laws may be not just an issue for Sri Lanka, but we definitely need to challenge the status quo.
Okay.
You know, there needs to be exposure of when these events happen. We have some institutions like Seabok, Transparency International. You have the big companies like Rio Tinto, who have had even people going to jail
Okay.
once these are reported.
I see.
So we must learn from their mistakes rather than repeat them here.
Sure. Sure. Absolutely. So you would say that is potentially the only way we could deal with it. Yeah.
I mean, there needs to be transparency, right? Transparency, good governance. You know, change has to start with someone.
So, Mr. Ryan, any closing final comments in our very lengthy and in-depth conversation?
So two things, Naveen. One is that we need to remember that good things take time.
Sure.
So if you look at the father of the iron ore industry in Australia, It was a gentleman called Lang Hancock.
Okay.
From the time he discovered iron ore in the Pilbara, in the outback, in the 50s and 60s, the time for the first mine to really start operating was the 70s and 80s.
I see.
Right? So it was, a good 2 decades. And, I was one of the beneficiaries years later
Right.
who worked at those mines in the
I see.
Pilbara,
Okay.
in the iron ore industry, amongst hundreds and thousands of others who were part of that sector.
I see.
So if we want to develop Sri Lanka, we also need to learn from these experiences and be patient, be consistent, and be practical.
Sure.
So I would say that I'm very glad that a Mineral Exporters Association has been formed and that they are hosting these kind of events.
Right.
And and I hope they will be united the same way JAF, the Apparel Association, was united and brought up the sector over the last 2 decades.
And was the association formed recently? Or?
Yes, I believe it's been formed earlier this year.
Okay.
So, I wish them all the very best.
Absolutely.
And thank you for your time and your questions.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thanks.